is Vani, and this is Fulbright Women Podcast Season 2. We're excited to bring to you 20 new brilliant women who are pushing the boundaries in their fields and lives and serving as inspirations to so many around them. Joining us today is Mohsina Atiq. Mohsina did a master's in policy economics from Williams College in 2014. She's currently working as a researcher for an environmental think tank in Canada, specializing in topics on the economic impacts of transitioning to a cleaner economy. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm really well. Thank you. Thank you so much for asking, and thank you for taking out the time. I think my first question to you would be, I'm really curious in understanding your current role as, the researcher that you said, you're currently a researcher at the think tank in Canada, right? So if you could just expand onto that, what does that entail?
Absolutely. So I conduct research for a think tank, as you said. It's called the Smart Prosperity Institute, and it is based at the University of Ottawa. So I'm based in Ottawa. And we are, our core focus is sort of working on the environment. So we're an environmental NGO. But more so in recent times, our focus has sort of expanded beyond sort of the core environmental realm to conduct research on some of the sort of sideline issues that have not really gotten a lot of attention in the recent past. So for example, questions around, what is the economic impact on different groups of people of transitioning to a low carbon or a net zero economy, depending on which terminology you want to use. And then what are some of the equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations when you're talking about just transitions? And then of course, there's obviously research that is conducted around the core environmental themes, sustainable finance, and then conservation and agriculture and circular economy. So we have teams that are focusing on all of that. But more so recently, so for example, housing is a big issue in Canada nowadays. So what are the environmental impacts of, constructing lots and lots of residential communities, around the suburbs? What is the cost of urban sprawl in different communities around the country? So, we have sort of really expanded into researching around all of these themes. What I basically do is, because I am an economist by training, so I look at economic policies and the impacts of economic policies. So a lot of my research in the past year or so has been focused around assessing the economic impact of Canada's transition to a net zero economy. Net zero being a controversial term, but that is sort of the terminology that the federal government has committed to and is using. So that's basically what I have been doing. And then along with that, I've also been looking at a lot of the equity, diversity, and inclusion, data and statistics around, how are certain groups in the economy impacted? And, question being, does it really matter what pathway do you take to transition to a low carbon or a net zero economy? How would a certain pathway impact different groups of people in the economy, whether you're talking about, economic sectors, or you're talking about different groups of people, so that's basically the kind of research that I do. It's sort of not core environmental research, but more looking at the economic impact of, transitioning to a greener or low carbon economy.
I really have a lot of questions to talk about, the impact, which is basically your research area as well. But before we move on to that, I want to understand this terminology a little bit more. So if you could expand on, net zero economy, and when did, the world and then Canada, or you personally as well, got interested into it?
I think that's a very pertinent question. There's so many terminologies going around all over the world, and they all mean very different things. So I, prefer using the terminology of a low carbon economy. It's much easier to understand. When we say net zero, what we're talking about is that net zero refers to the greenhouse gas emissions, right? So net zero greenhouse gases being emitted into, into the environment. But net zero, what that means is that it doesn't mean zero. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily mean that your economy is not emitting any GHGs, any greenhouse gas emissions. But what it means is that, you could be emitting GHGs in one part of your economy as long as you're compensating for them by, capturing and storing in another part of your economy. So on net, your country is not sort of emitting GHGs, but in reality it is. So it's not the perfect term. In an ideal world, you wouldn't want to be emitting GHGs at all. So you could still continue to produce oil and gas or coal. You could still continue to do those activities, but as long as there are certain plants in Canada that are in the business of taking carbon from the atmosphere and sort of storing it underground. So as long as you're doing that, you're okay. So that's what net zero means. A low carbon is, simply as the term suggests, low carbon as minimally low as possible. And then there's also the terminology green economy. Now that can really vary depending on who you're talking to. Different organizations, different countries, different people have different definitions for that. But basically green also refers to sort of, the methodologies or the processes of how you manufacture goods, electric vehicles, for example, or how you retrofit, homes and buildings. So green is also implies, a very minimalist or zero usage of any carbon in the process. But that can also, again, that definition can vary depending on who you're talking to.
Would green economy also mean including more renewable energy in your processes?
Yeah, absolutely. It would.
Okay, so let's talk about that then. There are multiple myths around, adopting renewable energy still in the world, right? The first one that I want us to talk about is, would transitioning to renewable energy hurt the economy?
Based on our research, no. So a lot of the economic modeling that we have been doing, and our research is sort of up there as well. And a lot of the research that has been coming out from Europe as well. Europe is very advanced in terms of the economic modeling that they have done on the subject. So their numbers and our numbers, say the same story. No, on overall, transitioning to renewable energy and more so transitioning to a net zero economy, a low carbon economy, is not bad for people, of course for the environment, but also for the economy. And the reason for that is because the transition period is going to be difficult, because obviously there are certain sectors where people will lose jobs. And when we talk about economic impact, we measure that in terms of GDP, but also in terms of jobs. So how many jobs will be created? How many jobs will be lost? So clearly, when you transition from certain sectors like the oil, gas, and coal sectors that are already well established, when you phase them out, there will be people who will lose their jobs, and that is going to be painful. That is the reality. But then, as you transition to other sectors, the electric vehicle manufacturing sector, and then so many other sectors that will crop up, in order for that transition to happen. So that would include sort of, investing in solar energy, that will include investing in wind power, that will include investing in, sustainable urban transit, that will include investing in densification in cities, that will include so many different sort of investment measures. And when you're going to invest in those sectors, they will create jobs in all of those sectors. So on net, that job creation is going to be more than sufficient to compensate the job loss. So on net, so when you talk about over the long period of time, so our research has focused on measuring the economic impact up to 2050, let's say. So the numbers show that up to 2030, you might see lots of folks losing their jobs. But then beyond that, there's going to be a lot of job creation. And the important thing to note is also that a lot of the sectors where people are currently working who might be, anticipated to lose their jobs, those people are, they have the skill set, and with a little bit of support and training from different governments and different institutions, they could transition, fairly smoothly into sectors that will see renewable sectors, green sectors, low carbon sectors that will see jobs cropping up. So that's an important point to note. It's not as if those people will be out of a job indefinitely. As long as there are proper training programs in place, proper support programs in place, especially during that transition time, the economy will create a lot of jobs. And as a matter of fact, a lot of our research has also indicated that there might be more jobs than people, especially in Canada's context, as we consider this transition. So our problem might be the opposite. We might not have enough people to fill those jobs, which is, some might say it's a good problem to have, but nevertheless, it could be a potential problem.
Interesting. So let's just talk about this transition period, right? You're saying this transition period could be messy, but then in long term, we're seeing that there are going to be, positive impacts of just moving on to renewable energy, right? Here, I kind of want to bring in, one of the other aspects that you said, you also do your research on equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? So when we look at it from that lens, obviously, there are going to be certain communities that would be affected more in comparison to others. When you do your research, how do you even first maybe expand onto that, and then maybe segue into, does your research also then, come up with like policies that you could, advise to people to sort of make it in any way less messier?
Absolutely. I think the EDI component is a very, very significant part of our research and is increasingly becoming so as well. And the reason for that is there are a few different angles to this, right? The groups of people that are disproportionately impacted by climate change is, as we know, and this is true all over the world, by the way, not just developing countries, but also here in Canada, the groups of people that are being impacted as we speak by adverse climate events are, certain groups of people that are either belong to a certain socioeconomic class, or they're Indigenous people, or they're, Black people, or they're people of color. There are the way, even industrialized economies are set up, there are certain features of the economy that tend to exclude certain groups of people. If you look at the data, for example, during the pandemic, the group of people that were the most impacted in terms of job loss and the ones who chose to completely drop out of the labor market were South Asian women. So it's definitely also the case that in certain parts of Canada, last year, for example, set records in terms of the heat wave that was experienced in certain parts of the country that led to wildfires that completely razed, residential communities to the ground. And then there was extreme amounts of flooding, and that's happening right now as well, spring flooding. And there are communities and homes and people that have been completely destroyed, and they had to evacuate. Those groups of people, if you look at them, a lot of them are Indigenous people. A lot of them are, poorer communities. A lot of them are folks who don't have their homes insured, who are completely and extremely vulnerable. And then sort of if you look at, the history of how some of these communities have been set up, it has been based on a lot of discriminatory policies. In Nova Scotia, for example, there's history of Black communities that were set up in places where there was a lot of industry and a lot of industries that were disposing of their waste and effluents in those communities, or they were based around infectious disease hospitals. So a lot of those folks ended up contracting fatal diseases because of that exposure. So that's certainly the case that these communities also tend to be more impacted by climate change and adverse climate change events, and are being impacted as we speak. But it's also the case that as we transition, for sure, there will be certain groups of people, because they are already on the fringe, they're already on the fringes, they're already being excluded from the labor market, from different sectors of the economy for so many different reasons. As we transition, it is absolutely necessary for us to mainstream equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations if we are to ensure that this pool of labor that you have, that is educated, that is skilled, and that is willing to sort of, be part of that transition, is equitably included as part of that transition. So I can give you a few examples. The manufacturing sector in Canada is set to be a very important part of this transition, because they will be the ones that will be manufacturing electric vehicles. They will be the ones that will be manufacturing home appliances, and so many different, products and services, solar panels, wind turbines. So the manufacturing sector will be huge in terms of job creation. But the manufacturing sector typically tends to employ white people and men, not just white people, but white men. The participation rate of indigenous people, of people of color, of Black people, of women is very low, even right now. So if that sector is primed for growth, for economic growth, it will be imperative to ensure that they are set up to, and they're supported in order to be able to hire all these different groups of people that exist in Canada and should be sort of be equitably part of that, transition. The construction sector is another example, and the story is the same. So what we need to do, and also young people, a lot of young people are not really interested in these sectors anymore because they were considered to be, they're not the tech industry. They're not. So a lot of sort of high school students need to be also incentivized in many ways, and women need to be incentivized because women have so many different considerations because of which they have been excluded from these traditionally male-dominated sectors. So, I mean, absolutely, in terms of who is impacted by this, by climate change, and who is impacted by this transition as far as the economy is concerned, different groups of people have to be mainstreamed into our considerations and into our policies. And we absolutely do recommend policies targeted towards the federal government, sometimes towards the provincial government, but a lot of our the policies that we suggest, some of which that I have sort of broadly mentioned, a lot of these policies are targeted towards the federal government, as well as towards in some cases, towards the provincial government, depending on the mandate, right? The federal government puts a lot of money into these things, but it's the provincial government, for example, that handles the labor market pieces of it. So it definitely targets them in terms of, recommending what all they should be looking at and what all they could potentially do in order to make this process smoother and less painful.
Very interesting. So basically what I heard you say was, we already know that the way we are living right now, there is kind of a hierarchy that's been imposed, where certain communities, go, certain communities, maybe even genders, lie below in the hierarchy. Some are, are more advantageous positions, right? So that may just continue unless we pay, attention to, our policies and recommendations that we make to incentivize their situations, right? So in terms of some of the recommendations, if I ask you to expand onto them, just for the sake of examples, what are some of the ways that we can help kind of cushion their, situation? But because in any case, they will be paying a price, right? So how can we make it less uncomfortable for them, for us to transition to renewable energies?
So I'll go back to the manufacturing example, right? Because that is a big and a very significant upcoming problem. So if you talk about the manufacturing sector, as I mentioned, the economic participation of women in the manufacturing sector here in Canada, and I'm pretty sure all over the world, is quite low in comparison to their male counterparts, right? And one of the reasons, has to do with a lot of taboos that also exist in terms of working in the manufacturing sector, in terms of creating a career in the manufacturing sector, right? And, working on the assembly line, it is a male-dominated atmosphere. So it all starts with a lot of, steps that the employers can take, but also the manufacturing council can take in terms of, providing support and training. A lot of it has to do with, gender inclusive training, or, equitable training that employers can give, or employers can also be given by these councils, by the provincial government, in terms of how they should be viewing applicants, and how they could potentially incentivize women to even apply a lot of women don't want to work in the manufacturing sector because of these taboos, because, if there are 50 men, one lone woman working on the assembly line could feel vulnerable in so many different ways. So that is one way. But the other way is also supporting their career, right? Women need to take maternity leaves, and they cannot create a career in any sector of the economy if their maternity leaves are not supported, if their family is not supported in a lot of different ways. So flexible timings, and then being and then the third angle of it is that a lot of women who do work in the manufacturing sector, it is very hard for them to progress and succeed to management level positions, for example, because of these subtle biases, or for example the taboo, or the misconception that women are not rugged enough to manage, let's suppose, a team on the assembly line. So a lot of it has to do with getting rid of these taboos as well. And there are certain employers, and there are small organizations, there are some places where change is happening, because awareness, because of a lot of awareness that is being spread by employers, but also a lot of employers are also in the dark. So they also need to be supported by the government, by the Canadian Manufacturing Council, in terms of easing this process. So that example sort of pertains simply to women, because the difference between the economic participation of men versus women is very stark. I think it's just about the people employed in the manufacturing sector. It's 30% are women, or perhaps even less if I'm not wrong. So that has to do with a lot of these different things. You have to incentivize the employers, but you also have to incentivize the women to actually come forward and be part of the manufacturing sector. And there are certain success stories of women who braved it, and who powered through, and they ended up becoming role models. So leveraging those role models to incentivize younger women to be part of the labor force in the manufacturing sector can also be, so marketing is one side of it as well. How you market yourself as an employer, as a sector, as a family-friendly organization, for example.
Mm-hmm. So, Mohsina, there's this one thing that we all know, that climate change is actually affecting certain countries way more than others, right? At the moment, there's a scale. So if we look at this, the global situation from the lens of the transitioning period, if we move on to the renewable energies, can you talk about that? Just looking at the, all the countries, will there be certain countries that will be affected more in comparison to, the messiness of the transitionary period that we're talking about? Will they be affected more than others?
Yeah, I do think. I think that the starting question would be what is the level of readiness of different countries in terms of embarking on that transition. As things stand, a lot of the industrialized economies in Europe, in North America is still a little behind. As far as all this sort of policy making and actually embarking on that transition is concerned, we're still in the phase where we're trying to convince policymakers that this is important and you should be doing this. But the industrialized economies are still their level of readiness, of course, is better compared to so many different developing countries around the world. So that's the first step. What is the level of preparedness? What is the level of political commitment to it? How convinced are policymakers? What is the level of investment that is being done into these different sectors? But at the same time, there's so many different pieces to this puzzle, right? Let's suppose, for instance, if Pakistan has committed to their net zero goal of achieving net zero GHG emissions, and even though Pakistan's contribution to global emissions is not high, comparatively, but it's still there, right? It's still there. And then there's so many things that the federal government in Pakistan and the provincial government in Pakistan and so many organizations could be doing in order to embark on that transition as well. But the question is the preparedness there? Is the readiness there? And the reality is that, and this is the economist in me speaking, the reality is that, Pakistan is a developing country. They're beset with so many other challenges at the moment that it's very hard for, for the transition to a low carbon economy. It's this particular theme, it's very hard for it to be prioritized on the agenda. When you're, but at the same time, the sad reality is that Pakistan is being impacted by extreme weather events, as we're seeing right now. One of the hottest year on record for South Asia. It's absolutely, shocking. So on the one hand, there are, as we speak, being impacted by climate change. On the other hand, it is also very difficult for them when the country is on the brink of default, right? It's very difficult for them to prioritize this subject. And hypothetically speaking, even if they do, I do think that the transition period, as you say, could potentially be much messier, because again, you need all that support system in place. You need all of those pieces in place. You need the provincial government, the federal government, you need all the labor organizations, and you need, a lot of support systems need to be in place for that transition to take place, and for that transition to be manageable, for people not to be jobless for years before, they eventually find a job in the low carbon economy. So yes, I do think that it's a very difficult subject for developing countries like Pakistan to even talk about, because they're looking to survive right now.
You're right, and that's what I wanted to get to next. It's pretty much a catch-22 situation, right? Where there are certain countries that are in dire need of some kind of relief from this, climate change that we're seeing in the world. Yet there is a dearth of a support system, like you said, right? But that would be my next question. Does anything like a support network or a support policy exist on a global level where, certain countries are put on the agenda that these are the ones that we need to help first to get out of this dire situation, or such a thing doesn't exist?
I could be wrong, but to my knowledge, no. I don't think that at a global level. There is one thing though, because I have worked on the sustainable development goals as well, and they're very comprehensive. If you dive sort of deeper into all the individual goals and their targets, there are a few targets that talk about the responsibility of richer countries to direct investment or to direct a higher portion of their ODA to developing countries in order to sort of deal with climate change. If because this was a few years ago, so I do not remember exactly which target that was, but those goals basically do take into consideration the level of disparity between the industrialized nations as well as the developing countries in terms of their capacity to even achieve the sustainable development goals. And to address that, they do talk about how industrialized nations need to commit more support, monetary support, as well as non-monetary support in helping. But that it's a very small part of those goals. You can easily miss it, right? There's, to my knowledge, the agenda that does exist, the Paris commitment and all of those things, the agenda that does commit. Even if there's something on paper, in my work so far, I have not seen any country. I haven't seen the European Union or the United States, Australia, United Kingdom, Canada, all of these countries that have spent so many decades actually emitting most of the greenhouse gas emissions. I haven't actually seen them come together to talk about how they can support or developing countries. And more than talk, I don't think that there is a fund, a global fund, right? It's apart from the GCF, and the Green Climate Fund, right? Apart from that, I don't think that there is as serious a commitment on part of the industrialized nations to support developing nations in terms of at least having those some of those pieces of puzzle in place, having that support system in place. Yeah, I would say it's, even if it's there, it's it's not as strong as it should be.
So as someone who's so invested in the issue and, researches upon, it on a daily basis, right? And also invested into the equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? Do you sometimes find yourself thinking about this at the global level and how unfair this is? Is it even unfair? In my personal opinion, I think, there is such a big disparity and there is this kind of level of unfairness to it. Do you find yourself thinking about it, or you're busy, thinking about how to get one country out of it and then we can get to the, others that need help?
It's not, it's one of those situations in which you just cannot be thinking about yourselves. It's not possible for Canada, for instance, to reach a net zero goal if the whole world is basically not at the same level or at a similar level. So I don't think that is possible or even ideal. So there are a couple of different things to it, right? There's a lot of disparity within countries as well, but there's also a lot of disparity across countries. So if you're talking about disparity across countries, I do think that it's quite unfortunate because we all know this fact that it is industrialized nations that have spent so many decades till we have reached this point where we've reached a tipping point where it's basically a point of no return. So it is these countries that have been investing so much money and capital into oil and gas and coal and all of these different resources, and also so many other things. It's not just these emissions. It's also plastic production. Where did that come from in the first place? It didn't happen in developing countries, right? And then overconsumption, and then living a wasteful lifestyle, using up resources to create clothes and food and you name it, for everything. Like the average family in North America produces a lot of waste, and all of that has taken place in the developed world. But the impact is, of course, disproportionately being felt by developing countries. So the typical argument that you hear from a lot of policymakers and policy experts and a lot of lay people, even from countries like Pakistan, is that we didn't create this problem. So why should we do something about it, or why are we suffering from it? I think the latter question is very valid. We shouldn't have to be suffering from this problem so disproportionately. But the former question is a little bit tricky. Now that we are in this situation and the whole world is in this situation, we're all in this together. So it is imperative, in my opinion, it is imperative for all governments to really commit to this agenda as much as their capacity allows them to, but to commit to it very seriously. Understandably, if you look at Pakistan's economy, if you look at Pakistan's budget books, so much money is already going into defense and, repaying your loans and keeping your economy afloat, and, into development expenditure, education, health, and, all of these things are at a bare minimum. But even so, it is still extremely important for, I think, political parties as well as policymakers and bureaucrats and everybody who really thinks about this issue. It's still important for them to say that yes, we get it. It's extremely hard for a developing country, and that too a country like Pakistan, to really prioritize this problem. But as much as possible, we still should be talking about this problem, prioritizing it, and looking at what are our low-hanging fruits. So, for example, what are some of the things that we can do easily and as quickly as possible in order to at least start the transition, or at least incentivize the transition. We can benefit from investing in solar power, and we all know that. So some of those things that we know can take place and easily without a lot of pain. I still think those conversations are very important, and they should transition from being just conversations to actual policy implementation.
I would just like to thank you so much for finding time for this podcast, and hopefully we can catch up on this conversation again in the future.